Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. A warm welcome to everybody to this first of the Sunday afternoon talks for this Rains Retreat season, the Vasa of 2018. So the title for today is The Good, the Bad and the Unconditioned. So Lumpur Sumedho was famous for coming up with nifty titles for his Sunday afternoon talks, so that the Sangha is endeavoring to follow in his footsteps. I didn't think of this one myself, but I thought it's a neat title, nifty title. So those of you who are familiar with popular culture in the West will recognize that there was a spaghetti western movie back in the 1960s with Clint Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef and other characters called The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. And so this gave the inspiration for the title for this afternoon, and the good and the bad and the unconditioned as they relate to Buddha's teachings. And so I'll offer a few reflections on this theme, and as is usual, I'll talk for about an hour, then we'll have a period of time for a cup of tea, and then some opportunity for questions and discussion after that. So this theme of good and bad and the unconditioned, it relates to a particular format that you find within the Buddha's teaching, and an emphasis that is, I think, very helpful and significant in terms of our use of the Buddha's teachings, and its contrast to a number of other religious traditions. So, for example, back in the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche published a book called Beyond Good and Evil, and that was a way of critiquing his own sort of view of the moral limitations of the philosophies of his time, the Judeo-Christian morals, or what's come down from the sort of Greek philosophy in the earlier times. So Friedrich Nietzsche was trying to point out that we can have a very limited view of what good and bad are, good and evil are, but if we're going to evolve, then we have to look beyond that. Now, I wouldn't suggest that Friedrich Nietzsche was an arahant. Perhaps he's the arahant with the biggest moustache ever. But in his efforts, I think he was trying to look beyond the narrow confines, the narrow limitations of the ordinary way that we think of good and bad or good and evil, and the customary way that we have as a society of thinking that if we could just wipe out evil, then all that would be left would be good, and that would be good. But it's not quite so simple as that, I would suggest. These ideas of getting beyond good and evil and say letting go of standard moral forms. Nietzsche was maybe the first one in modern times to sort of put that into words, but it was also a very popular philosophy through the 20th century, and particularly in the 60s and 70s, that there was a sense of the society, many people breaking free from the limitations of materialistic thinking and the sort of moral judgments of the religious traditions of Jewish thinking or Christian thinking, and that the idea of, well, why are we limited by that? Why do we have to follow those rules? Who says that's what good is? Who says that's what bad is? Who's to say? It's up for us as free individuals to decide. So in that era, there's the kind of counterculture, the hippie era of the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of throwing off of those kind of limitations, a discarding of the sort of standard ideas of good and bad, right and wrong, and an eagerness not to just conform to the standards of society, because that's what your parents did and that's what good people are supposed to do, and that's a sense of obedience to a cultural form. And there was like a breaking out of the kind of materialistic viewpoints. So there was, I feel there was a very good spirit within that. And then coming across ideas like Nietzsche, or also what you found within some of the Advaita Vedanta non-dualist Vedic teachings, also within the Zen tradition, and also within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, you had a lot of teachers who were, or ways of speaking that were kind of directly, say, critiquing the narrow views of good and bad and right and wrong and society's forms, and talking about, throwing it all out and just being a completely free being. And so that was very popular in that era, and also with a lot of the drug taking and the kind of breaking out of the limits of the 1950s, that there was a kind of upsurge of interest in those teachings and drawing upon those different traditions. I would say that probably most of the Advaita Vedanta masters who were being quoted would kind of shake their heads at some of the things were being done in the spirit of those non-dual teachings, or some of the people who established these Zen principles of making statements like, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, this kind of thing, and that when you come across teachings like that are what you call iconoclastic, pulling down the icons or destroying the icons, you find that the person who said them was actually an extremely strict monk, or someone who was a very dedicated renunciant and very unindulgent in their behavior. But they were speaking in ways that were trying to help people to break through narrow modes of thinking. But in the 60s and 70s, then the people in the West in particular took that all very much at face value. So this kind of what they call crazy wisdom became quite popular. I can see there's a few grey heads in the audience, so most of us will remember much of the 60s and 70s. A few of us were there. I was born in 1956, so I was a late flower child. So I was just coming into my teens in the late 60s. So that kind of crazy wisdom idea of just defying conventions, doing whatever you feel like, and just being enlightened. As long as there was a sense of being aware, being awake, then whatever impulse you felt, whether it was indulgent or following a desire or following an angry feeling or a jealous feeling, whatever you did, as long as you were fully awake and aware of it, then that was a pure act. This is a paraphrase, but you would get people writing things like, well, someone would complain that you're angry. I'm not angry. I'm just being. This is angry Buddha manifesting. This is you're being really greedy. Why are you taking more than your fair share? I'm not being greedy. This is just greedy Buddha being manifest. And so there's a lot of this kind of use of these principles, or you can say the principles of ultimate reality, to dismiss the standards of good and bad, right and wrong, and what's wholesome and unwholesome, as an expression of liberation from that. And many of the prominent Buddhist teachers really loved these stories, and us as sort of rule-keeping monastics would often be on the kind of receiving end of this. There was a favorite story that you would hear being told in when you're in sort of Buddhist circles, where different Buddhist traditions were being represented and different Buddhist teachings were being offered. People seem to love to tell the story of these two monks who get to the side of a flooded river, and there's a young woman standing by the river looking perplexed. Oh, what can I do? I can't get across the river. And one of the monks picks up the girl and carries her across the river, wades through the water and carries her across and puts her down on the other bank. And then the other monk kind of wades along behind them, and then they all emerge from the river, and the girl says, "Oh, thank you very much, you're so kind, you're so helpful." And they walk on. And the monk who didn't carry the girl then is getting more and more upset and more angry, and then finally he stops his friend and says, "How can you do that? That was outrageous. That's completely against our rules. You're not supposed to touch a woman, let alone pick a girl up and carry her like that. That's outrageous. That's improper. That's totally inappropriate." And and then the first monk turns around to his friend and says, "Oh, I put the girl down by the river. It seems like you're still carrying her." So I don't know how many times I heard that story being told. And then you kind of get a sort of sideways glance like, "Did you get that, Ajahn?" Yeah. And so they're kind of a prodding at the sort of rule-keeping types like us. So, which is fair enough, because people, in a sense, they're trying to be respectful of the unconditioned or the liberated, the kind of transcendent side, and saying that's more important than all the rules and rituals and conventions. So this is an area that's I feel helpful to understand. And also, if we look at the number of scandals that occurred just within the Buddhist world over some of these people who are supposed to be sort of quote unquote crazy wisdom masters, or who are sort of speaking regularly from this sort of the viewpoint of the unconditioned or the transcendent, often their behavior was really quite outrageous and ended up in at least in lawsuits, if not in in worse than that. And so I was remembering, when reflecting on the theme for today, I was at a conference of Buddhist teachers with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala back in, I think it was 1995 or 96. And there had been a recent batch of scandals within the Shambhala community. Chogyam Trungpa's conduct was brought into question, since he was an extremely heavy drinker and had numerous sexual partners that his wife apparently was approving of, but he was very active in that mode, and died, I think, from alcoholism, and so that was brought into question. Then his chief disciple, his Dharma heir, then had infected various students with AIDS, apparently knowing he was infected and having sex with his students anyway. So this was a huge scandal in that era, and I won't go into other details, but other scandals have arisen. And anyway, there was this question that was put forward to His Holiness about crazy wisdom. He said, well, what was his opinion? What was his view about this, say, trying to teach from the transcendent position and discarding all of the standard forms of correct or incorrect, beautiful or inappropriate behavior? And it was very interesting, because the term crazy wisdom is quite common in the West. Probably many of you have heard of that in various Dhamma books. I think there was a Trungpa book called Crazy Wisdom. But the term was used in this description. And even though His Holiness had, and many people have great respect for Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche and the community he established, certainly there's no question that his behavior was pretty extreme. That he was known to be a seriously alcoholic and so forth. That was not a secret in any way. Anyway, this term crazy wisdom was put to His Holiness, and he looked sort of puzzled, and he turned to his translator, Thubten Jinpa, and said, "Crazy wisdom? What does that mean?" And then they went into a little huddle, a nice little huddle to sort of try and explain it. So Thubten Jinpa was Tibetan, but he was doing a doctorate in philosophy at Cambridge University, so he was also well acquainted with the Western Dhamma scene and Western ways of thinking. And so then they came out of the huddle, and His Holiness said, "I think this is just crazy, no wisdom." There's no such thing, in Tibetan Buddhism. That doesn't really exist. There's no way of qualifying that. There were certain sort of heroes of the Tibetan Buddhist world, like Drukpa Kunle, whose behavior was quite kind of extreme in various ways. So it's true there are certain characters like that, but it was always, say, put forward or explained or talked about within the context of Dharma practice, or being used as skillful means. Anyway, also in that same conference, a fellow a Zen teacher from America, an American Zen teacher, spoke up, and he had just sort of divorced himself from his teacher. So he had just received what they call Dharma transmission from his teacher, and he was extremely critical of his teacher's behavior. I won't, out of politeness, because there's several cameras and recordings going here, I won't repeat the exact words that he used to describe his teacher, but the essence of it was that he was a narcissistic psychopath. That was his reference to his teacher. But also he said, "I have no doubt about his enlightenment, there's no question about that, but his behavior was atrocious." And when he said that, and His Holiness's English is quite good, so he understood that. Again, he sort of, what? And he went into a huddle with Thubten Jinpa again and said, is he saying that his teacher is totally enlightened? He just called him a narcissistic psychopath, but yet he's saying he has no doubt about his enlightenment, and that even though he's enlightened, his behavior is appalling. And Thubten Jinpa said, yeah, that's right. So His Holiness came out of the huddle again and said, I think we have a misunderstanding here about what enlightenment means. And it led to a very interesting discussion, it was surprising how much His Holiness's point of view was very much in line with the Southern Buddhist view that you have from the Theravada representatives that were there, which is, if there is enlightenment, then necessarily the person's behavior is going to be sort of scrupulously sort of careful and thoughtful and harmless. And so an enlightened person might be eccentric, but they couldn't be as sort of indulgent or as harmful as the behavior of these people were being described. So that things have calmed down a little bit in this respect, but it's still, if you take a look at the Buddhist news feeds in the last few months, there have been again scandals in the Chogyam Trungpa's son. There have just been very negative reports about his behavior, and also Sogyal Rinpoche. And I mean, I'm not trying to be sort of shaming people in public. These are all fairly well-known figures and fairly well-reported issues. But I feel that a lot of that difficulty and a lot of the pain and complicated and confusing, distressing situations that have occurred within the Buddhist field and other spiritual traditions is through this radical misunderstanding of how the conditioned and the unconditioned relate to each other, how the ultimate reality and the quality of transcendence, how that relates to our behavior and the concepts that we have of good and bad, and how the transcending of good and bad doesn't necessarily mean a kind of defying of the mores, the standards of noble behavior in society, but rather it sort of goes in the opposite direction. So within the Pali Canon, there's a very interesting teaching of the Buddha. It's in the Book of the Nines in the Anguttara Nikaya, where the Buddha talks about the conduct of an enlightened being. This is, if you're interested, I looked it up this morning just to check. So the Book of the Nines, suttas number 7 and number 8. And the Buddha in these suttas, he says, for an enlightened being, they are incapable of deliberately taking life. So like an arahant cannot consciously and deliberately take the life of another being. They might tread on an ant because their attention is somewhere else, and they might not know, but that they've trodden on an ant. But they're incapable of deliberately taking life. They are incapable of telling a lie, so that literally the tongue can't form the words of an untruth. They can't. They are not interested. They are naturally celibate. They have no interest in engaging with others in any sexual way whatsoever. They are incapable of stealing, of taking what is not given. So those first 4 precepts against killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, and lying, that those are absolutely intrinsic to an enlightened being. So from the Theravada perspective, also from the perspective of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, if someone really has realized the unconditioned, awakened, and embodies that transcendent reality, then naturally their behavior will be noble and harmless and respectful of the lives of other beings. Interestingly enough, with respect to the 5th precept, you might be wondering, are all arahants teetotalers? So just in case that thought crossed your mind. Interestingly enough, in that sutta, those 2 suttas, the 5th principle that an arahant keeps to is not related to intoxicants, but it's related to possessions. So it says an arahant cannot lay up a store of things, that they won't keep something that they get given today for tomorrow. They won't kind of keep a bit for extra or just in case. That the mind, again, doesn't work in that way of like, oh, well, I might need this in the future, therefore I better keep a few of these just in case. That which is an interesting food for thought and reflection, that one who is naturally enlightened does not, say, make provision for the next day, but is living in with a natural sense of trust. So our monastic rule, say, reflects that quality of, say, the food that was given this morning, that we eat what we need, we give up what was left over, and we have no control about what happens tomorrow. So our Vinaya rule reflects that what is the natural behavior of an enlightened being, that we let the what we've been offered today be enough, and then tomorrow, well, we'll see what happens. So I also thought I'd bring along a few of Ajahn Chah's teachings and share some of those with you on this principle today. But also, I think it's with respect to the this idea, particularly to in the sort of within Western Buddhist circles, the sort of life-affirming aspect of, if you're totally enlightened, you can do whatever you feel like. Why bother being a renunciate? Why bother being a nun or a monk? If you're totally enlightened, of course your behavior will be completely free and spontaneous. Why bother dressing up in robes and having all these rules? So, which is again a point that's frequently made by people who are not in robes. I mean, often we're very good friends with a lot of the people who say these things, and have interesting discussions together on a regular basis. But in a way, it's a fair point to make. Why would one use these ancient and traditional forms? Why have so many rules if the point is to be free, to transcend all limitations? But again, I feel that point of view is based on a bit of a misunderstanding. Because if you consider it, so if we take the Buddha as our example, if he was completely enlightened and totally incapable of suffering, why did he choose to live as a penniless monk? Why did he choose to live on alms food, traveling around Bihar and Uttar Pradesh on foot for 45 years? It's interesting, and that doesn't usually get considered by the more sort of freewheeling enlightened types. If we take the Buddha as a great wise being, a sort of exemplar of wisdom, why did he choose to live as a renunciate? Why did he choose to not pursue entertainments, or to live a celibate life, or to live on alms food? Why was that? Why would he choose to live that way? And so that, again, I would suggest that the motivation for the Buddha as a fully enlightened being, and I'm not trying to intimidate those of you who are not wearing robes or who have hair and earrings and such like. I'm not trying to put you off. I mean, these Sunday afternoon talks are for the public, not just for the monastic community. But I feel it's a helpful principle to contemplate. So why would the Buddha, if he's totally enlightened and completely incapable of suffering, he's got all kinds of wonderful powers, so he could kind of entertain himself in all sorts of glorious and interesting, colourful ways, far beyond anything that you could find on the internet or through your iPhone. But yet he chose to live a life of total simplicity, harmlessness, a life of renunciation, travelling on the dusty paths of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, just being available to teach others and to share his wisdom. So I feel it's a very powerful and important reflection. There's again a teaching that the Buddha gave in a dialogue with a man called Markandeya. It's in the middle length discourses, Sutta number 75, the Markandeya Sutta. And Markandeya is a kind of life-affirming sensualist type. So he can't figure out why anyone who's interested in freedom and spiritual happiness would not want to just enjoy everything. Enjoy life. It's all there for the taking. Just feast yourself. It's all there to be enjoyed. Come on, join the party. And so Markandeya has that kind of an attitude, and he asks the Buddha, why? What's the point of renunciation? Because it seems like such a loss, and why give up so many good things that are so helpful and beautiful, interesting, delightful, enjoyable? And the Buddha then says to Markandeya, so Markandeya, if you were not a human being, but you were living as a Deva prince up in the Nandana Grove, up in the Tavatimsa heaven, the heaven of the 33 deities. So you're living there in the Nandana Grove, and you've got 500 beautiful celestial nymphs who are your concubines and your partners, and this is your place. You live there. You just have this kind of paradisical existence according to your value system. So if you lived up in the Nandana Grove with 500 celestial concubines, would you be interested in your life here in Savatthi as a human being? And he said, well, no, of course not. This is there's no comparison. If I was a Deva prince up in the Nandana Grove, the life on earth as a human being would have no interest, no value. It would not be the least bit compelling at all. And then the Buddha says, well, Magandia, the kind of happiness that I enjoy as with the heart free from greed, hatred, and delusion, is as more extreme a kind of happiness and delight. It's as high above the joy that you would feel in the Nandana Grove as a Deva Raja in the Nandana Grove would feel to be above that the happiness you can find here in the world through your food and your music and your clothes and your decorations and so on and so forth. So it's not because I kind of dismiss or criticize that kind of happiness. It's just I'm not interested because the kind of happiness that I know is so far beyond that. It's like there's no comparison. There's no way to put the two together. So the Buddha in that is pointing out that the joyfulness of the awake mind, the free mind, is such that the there's no need to seek after particular kinds of sensual experience or particular kinds of activity to find happiness, because the awake mind, the free mind in itself, is intrinsically joyful and peaceful and contented and fulfilled and filled with delight. And therefore, the more simple that one's life is on the material plane, then the easier it is to be able to appreciate that inner happiness, that inner joy, that inner freedom. And so that's really lies behind many of the principles that he established through his teaching over many, many years. So some of these readings, I know Ajahn Chah told us never to prepare Dhamma talks, so this is kind of heretical to be quoting him, but I'm sure if he was still in existence, he would forgive me, because I feel these are very wise and helpful teachings on this exact theme. So this is the collected teachings of Ajahn Chah. So I'll just read a few passages from this. If there is no long, there is no short. If there is no right, there can be no wrong. People these days study away, looking for good and evil, but that which is beyond good and evil, they know nothing of. All they know is the right and the wrong. I'm going to take only what is right. I don't want to know about the wrong. Why should I? If you try to take only what is right, in a short time it'll go wrong again. Right leads to wrong. People keep searching among the right and the wrong, and they don't try to find that which is neither right nor wrong. They study about good and evil. They search for virtue, but they know nothing of that which is beyond good and evil. They study the long and the short, but that which is neither long nor short, they know nothing of. They didn't study that which is beyond good and evil. This is what you should study. Let's see. In this way, we can dwell in a natural state, which is peace and tranquility. If we are criticized, we remain undisturbed. If we are praised, we're undisturbed. Let things be in this way. Don't be influenced by others. This is freedom. Knowing the two extremes for what they are, one can experience well-being. One does not stop at either side. This is genuine happiness and peace. Transcending all things of the world, one transcends all good and evil. One is above cause and effect, beyond birth and death. The original mind is beyond good and bad. This is the original nature of the mind. If you feel happy over experiencing a pleasant mind object, that's delusion. If you feel unhappy over experiencing an unpleasant mind object, that is delusion. Unpleasant mind objects make you suffer. Pleasant ones make you happy. This is the world. Mind objects come with the world. They are the world. They give rise to happiness and suffering, good and evil, and everything that is subject to impermanence and uncertainty. When you separate from the original mind, everything becomes uncertain. There is just unending birth and death, uncertainty and apprehensiveness, suffering and hardship, without any way of halting it or bringing it to cessation. And then, lastly, it's actually the very first paragraph of the very first teaching in this collection. This talk is called The Middle Way Within. The teaching of Buddhism is about giving up evil and practicing good. Then, when evil is given up and goodness is established, we must let go of both good and evil. We've already heard enough about wholesome and unwholesome conditions to understand something about them. So, I'd like to talk about the middle way. That is, the path to transcend both of those things. So the basic structure that you have within the Buddha's teaching is that encouragement to let go of the unwholesome, to recognize if this is followed, if there's an angry impulse or a greedy impulse or a selfish impulse or a lustful impulse, if that is followed and that you act out of an angry feeling or you speak out of a jealous or a aggressive feeling or a greedy feeling, then there's going to be a painful result necessarily coming from that. If those impulses are recognized and understood, then the training is not to think of those as absolutely evil or intrinsically making you a bad person as in an absolute or complete way, but rather, if this is followed, pain will come afterwards. So we train ourselves to recognize those unwholesome, unskillful impulses, what we call akusala. And then those qualities that are wholesome, that which leads to peace of mind, that which leads to harmony between ourselves and others, that which leads to a kind of brightness of heart, so kindness, generosity, unselfishness, restraint with regards to, say, destructive or kind of greedy or selfish impulses. If those are followed and developed, then we realize, when the mind is guided towards generosity, towards unselfishness, towards concentration, then the result is pleasant for this person, it's pleasant for other people, everybody gains. So there's all of the teaching about sila, virtue and conduct, is to do with recognizing the unwholesome and letting go of it, recognizing the wholesome, cultivating the wholesome, and sustaining it. This is what the Buddha talked of as right effort. So that's the structure in terms of conduct. But then, as Ajahn Chah is pointing out then the challenge is to let go, to not attach even to goodness, to not say, okay, I want this is bad and wrong. We need to wipe that out, and this is good and helpful. So we need to keep this and hang on to this. And if we can just wipe out all the bad and keep the good, then we'll be happy. And that's very much a kind of theme of Western society, isn't it? They're trying to destroy evil. But how often has the effort to destroy evil and to wipe out what we don't like or what we don't approve of, that's just led to more harm and more destruction. There's many painful instances where you have, like, say, in the Christian church, persecuting heretics, burning witches, or in the Nazi Germany, wiping out the gay people and the Jews and the Romanis and all of the beings they thought were harmful and destructive and a sort of pollution to the world. Get rid of what we see as evil, and then what will remain will be good. But in those very, those efforts which might have started out with a good intention, the very effort or judging this as good and that as bad, and then the idea of wiping out the bad and leaving only the good, what does it bring us? I'm using some extreme examples to get our attention. But that was the thought behind the Inquisition or behind these kind of movements, or in Cambodia, the destruction of the Cambodian people by the Khmer Rouge. Millions of people, about 2 million people, were killed by the Khmer Rouge, kind of quote unquote purifying the society. So in our effort to do the good, we can end up doing far more harm. And there was a little statement by Alexander Solzhenitsyn that I was very struck by many years ago. He says, it would be so easy if evil was an absolute and we could just isolate it and wipe it out. Unfortunately, the battle line between good and evil runs through the heart of every person. So that I thought it was very well put by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, that if only we could isolate the bad and destroy it, then all that would be left would be the good. But life doesn't work that way. And as he points out, I think quite insightfully, that the heart is capable of the wholesome and the noble and the beautiful, and it's capable of the harmful and the destructive, and everything in between. So the one of the most important teachings in this respect is called the parable of the raft in the Buddha's simile that he uses. He says, if imagine that you are on one bank of a river, it's dangerous and painful, and there's a lot of harm is likely to come to you, and on one side of the river, but on the other side there is safety and security and ease. So you really want to get across from the dangerous bank of the river to the safe bank of the river. And so he said, then if you did, then you gather together sticks and wood and vines, and you put together a raft, and then you'd paddle across the river as best you could to get to the safety of the other shore. That's what we would do. So he said, this is the description of our lives as living beings, that we live in this world of say, self-centered thinking, of greed, hatred, and delusion, the conditionings that we have that are sort of, painful and dangerous, and the precarious nature of life. It's like life on this shore. And then the Dhamma teaching, these principles of letting go of the unwholesome and cultivating the wholesome, they're like the raft that we put together. And then we paddle across using that raft to get to the place of safety, that place of having cultivated the good and created these wholesome influences in our life, and then, say, having put those into effect and having arrived at a quality of happiness, of contentment, of freedom, then the Buddha said, having arrived at the safe shore, is it wise to then pick up the raft thinking, this raft has served me so well, this is just what I needed, it's been such a blessing to me, and therefore I'll carry it with me wherever I go. So then you pick up the raft, put it on your shoulder, and then carry it around with you while you're on the safe shore. He said, no, you wouldn't do that, because the raft has served its purpose, therefore you leave it on the bank and you go your own way. So when Ajahn Chah says letting go of good and evil, letting go of or being beyond good and evil, being above cause, beyond effect, letting go of those dualistic ways of thinking, it's rather like that letting go of the Dhamma as a kind of a conditioned structure, letting go of the ideas, letting go of the forms. You don't destroy them or defy them, but you're recognizing, well, it served its purpose, but I don't need to identify with that. I don't need to claim this as who and what I am. So in this respect, the teachings of wisdom, and particularly the teachings about not self, are very important. And then the teachings that the Buddha gave about the unconditioned, so that when we have used the wholesome, we've let go of the unwholesome, we've cultivated the wholesome, then that, in a way, that maximizes the conditions for helping the mind to awaken. So in a way, the evil is not absolutely evil, good is not absolutely good, but the reason why we cultivate goodness is that it helps things to be simple. It uncomplicates our heart, it uncomplicates the mind, it clarifies. Goodness clarifies. If I act in ways that are deceitful, that are destructive, that are selfish, that are unkind, that are cruel, that are dishonest, that complicates, that makes the heart confused and tense. So you can say there is ultimately there's no good or evil, like in Hamlet. One of Hamlet's famous statements in Shakespeare's play is, there is nothing good or bad, but our thinking makes it so. Right? There is nothing that is good and bad intrinsically, completely, but our thinking makes it so. But what the Buddha points out is that what we call kusala, wholesome, that's what helps to clarify the mind. That's what helps to lead to simplicity and ease of heart. And what is akusala, what is unwholesome, that leads to confusion, to alienation, to insecurity, to stress. Therefore, it makes things harder to see. It makes a greater quality of agitation and complexity. It frees the mind. Just like if you're, and I'm not reading anybody's mind, so I have no abilities in that respect. But if you have told somebody a lie during the day, or if you have cheated in some respect during the day, and or you've killed something during the day, when you sit down to meditate in the evening, what is right there? You remember the lie. You remember those unkind words. You remember that deceitful act, that destructive act. It's right there. That's what you feel. If instead you have acted in a way that is harmless and kind, you've been honest, when you sit down to meditate in the evening, you don't have a thought, oh dear, I was honest today, that's a shame. That's really awful. No, it doesn't work that way, does it? It's ridiculous. What happens is there's just a kind of an easeful brightness in the heart that goes, oh, the mind is settled, the mind is able to relax, is able to be open. So that's why goodness is good, is because it helps to clarify the mind. That's why badness is bad, is because it confuses the mind. And that's really I would say, the essence of it in terms of the Buddha's approach, not seeing good and bad as absolute qualities, but the effect that they have on the human level. So then the unconditioned, and that is what when we have used that quality of peacefulness and clarity that comes with the say skillfulness of action, then that quality of wisdom helps the mind to awaken to that ultimate reality of things. So the good and the bad and the unconditioned. Good and bad is more familiar to us. The word the unconditioned is maybe a bit more mysterious, so we haven't got a clear sense of what that refers to. So this is a term referring to the fundamental nature of reality, or the transcendent nature of Dhamma. And there's several passages where the Buddha speaks about this very directly, particularly in the collection of teachings called the Udana, or the inspired utterances of the Buddha. So in chapter 8 of the Udana, and this was one of Luang Por Sumedho's favorite teachings, and actually one of the last things that he did when he was here as the abbot of Amaravati was he instituted us bringing this particular sutta into the daily chanting. Not that we don't chant it every day, but very regularly. So these are suttas number 1 and suttas number 3 in the 8th chapter of the Udana, and the one that was Luang Por Sumedho's favorite goes, there is the unborn, the unconditioned, the uncreated, the unformed. If there was not the unconditioned, the unborn, the uncreated, the unformed, then liberation from the conditioned, the created, the born, the formed would not be possible. But because there is the unconditioned, the unborn, the uncreated, the unformed, therefore liberation from the conditioned, the formed, the liberated, the limited is possible. So atti bhikkhave ajatang abhutang akatang asankatang is the Pali of that. So Luang Por really loved to reflect on that, because it's reminding us that beyond the habitual ways of seeing the world in terms of sight, sound, smell, taste and touch, beyond the habits of seeing things in terms of self and other, the fundamental reality of all things, of this mind, this world, the fundamental reality, the Satya Dhamma, the true Dhamma, the transcendent reality, is an ever-present quality. And if we are wise, then we remember that, we recollect that, we awaken to that. So in a sense, that's what is discovered on the other shore. That's what's found on the other shore. So the raft of the letting go of the unwholesome and cultivating the wholesome, and developing wisdom, that's what carries the mind across to the safe shore. And what is realized, what is sort of found on the other shore, is this quality of the unborn, the unconditioned, the uncreated, the unformed. So that is, what the conditions that help the mind to genuinely awaken to its fundamental nature. So as I was saying, so we call this enlightenment or liberation. These are the kind of terms that are used to describe this. But if if we have a partial experience, or maybe during the course of meditation, we might have an insight into that, and that insight can be genuine or can be very close to complete, then I would say this is what becomes the basis of that kind of crazy wisdom, or these sort of Zen masters behaving in unruly ways and such like. I'm not saying that Theravadins are void of fault, absolutely not. But it's very, very rare indeed for people out of the southern Buddhist world to make these claims of total enlightenment and then engaging in unskillful behavior. They just engage in unskillful behavior without claiming to be enlightened. I think that's fair enough to say that. Yeah, okay. I've got confirmation here on my left. So well, but in a way, I mean, not saying that's a good thing, but in a way, it's at least you're not presenting that kind of say destructive behavior as enlightened activity. I mean, where you've got the Dharma heir, and he was quite happy to say, "I am the Dharma heir of Roshi X," and claim that sort of as his credentials, and then literally in the same breath to say Roshi X is a narcissistic psychopath who's totally enlightened. So you don't find that in the Theravada world. So I'm very, very glad that I ran into this particular zone of Buddhist activity rather than the other ones, because it's easy for the mind to get drawn into those ways of thinking. So what I feel is very important then is to reflect on that what you have in us quoting from the Anguttara Nikaya, the passage where the Buddha says, if someone is fully enlightened, when the mind is fully awake, then it becomes incapable of violence. It becomes incapable of theft or taking what is not given. It's not interested in relating to other beings in terms of sexual activity. It can't incline towards deceit. It's incapable of dishonesty or of any kind of deceptive behavior. So it's interesting that in the Jataka stories, the stories of the Buddha's previous births, that there's an interesting point that's made in one of the Jatakas, where it's said that during the course of his incalculable numbers of lives, the Bodhisattva broke most of the precepts. He took life, he engaged in sexual misconduct, he stole things, he lied, he kind of indulged in intoxicants, various different stories. Quite kind of overtly, quite woven very much into many of the Jataka stories. But it says the one precept that he never broke after he'd made the Bodhisattva vow was the fourth precept, because intrinsic to the vow to become a Buddha is truthfulness. That the adherence of the heart to Dhamma means it is incapable of deceit. So that through all those lifetimes when he kind of seduced people's wives, or he got drunk on various different things, or was a warrior and killed many, many people as a soldier, that he never told a lie during all those lifetimes. And I understand, this is mythology, it's not sort of provable history, kind of documented history, it's mythology, but I feel it's a very important and powerful myth that during that entire course of the career of the Bodhisattva to arrive at Buddhahood, during that whole period, it was not capable of any kind of deceit. So in a way, it puts that fourth precept in a very unique position. That's the quality that is most naturally intrinsic to the awake mind is total truthfulness. So that might be very intimidating to hear that, but I feel it's also it's intimidating maybe to our egos and our habits, but it's also refreshing to the heart, and something that says, yeah, that makes sense. If it's Dharma, if it's the truth that we're being awakened to, the heart is awakening to, then necessarily that will express itself in terms of truthful words that are in accordance with reality. So that in this way, the expression that you have of the relationship between the good and the bad and the unconditioned is that when the unconditioned has genuinely and fully been realized, then the heart naturally inclines towards the good. That if that awakening is full and complete, if you say the mind awakens to its fundamental nature, and that is completely undiluted and unobstructed, then what comes forth is skillful conduct. And sometimes that is not necessarily say put together in that way. And oftentimes people, we find that we can really rejoice in, say, being on retreat or sitting in meditation. We really love to meditate because the mind is so peaceful and quiet. You can forget about your body, you can forget about other people, you can forget about your job, your possessions, your list of things to do, your unanswered emails. It's all gone, and the mind can just focus on the ultimate reality of the present moment. We love to be on retreat, in a retreat center. Other people are doing the cooking, everyone is silent, we don't have to perform socially, we don't have to be anybody. So we can unconsciously be kind of revering that sort of unconditioned, that the mind in a free state, the mind enjoying that quality of simplicity. And then, but in that enjoying or kind of investing in that formless and uncomplicated quality, we can be unconsciously rejecting having to be a person, having a job, having emails that need to be answered, having to talk to people, having to deal with the body and your illnesses and so on and so forth. So there can be, and this is quite common in Buddhist practice and in the sort of Buddhist meditation world, a kind of revering of the unconditioned and the transcendent qualities, and a kind of dismissiveness. So I don't want to bother with a grubby reality, or that's just the conditioned world. Pah, I spit on the conditioned world. Pah. Only interested in the unconditioned. That's all. Just enlightenment. That's all that matters. And it's understandable. I've had those attitudes myself. But I feel that that's very limited and also destructive. It's like by trying to grasp the unconditioned or the formless or the unborn, you're actually creating more birth. We're being born into the attachment to an identification with that kind of simplicity or that disconnection from the sense world, the disconnection from personality and relationship and so on, which can be destructive, because then that you're always kind of afraid that the world's going to intrude, it's going to come and bother me. But as Ajahn Chah said when he was giving some Dhamma teaching in a noisy shrine room in London many years ago, that he said to the people, you think the sound from across the street is annoying you, but actually it's you that's annoying the sound. Or just like this morning in the temple, the last sitting this morning, and there's lots of visitors and small children running around and making their children noises. And it was exactly that possibility. So are the sounds of the kids annoying me, or am I annoying the sound of the kids? So if we establish that I'm only interested in the unconditioned, the unformed, the uncreated, I'm only interested in transcendence, and I don't want to bother, quote unquote, with the material world, and we have a dismissive, we're kind of born into a rejecting or dismissive or derogatory attitude towards that, then we create the conditions for fear. We're going to be bothered. We are creating botheredness, because the bothering is coming from our own mind. It's not coming from sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. The bother is coming from the attitude of the heart. So one of the stories from the scriptures, again from the Buddhist mythology, that I feel illustrates this really, really well, is the story of the Buddha and his enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. And again, there are many ways you can interpret the myth of the enlightenment and the attack by Mara, but I feel it speaks to this very issue of the relationship between the conditioned and the unconditioned. So the Bodhisattva has sat down under the Bodhi tree and has made this resolve. That I will not move from this spot until full and complete enlightenment has been realized. And he knew that the paramitas, the spiritual perfections, were very very close to being totally fulfilled. He knew he was extremely ripe. And this was a realistic determination, but he knew it was one he had to make. So he sat down under the Bodhi tree, said, I will not move from this spot, whether my bones turn to dust and my blood dries up. I will not move until full and complete enlightenment has been realized. So then when we make that kind of resolution, when you sit down on your cushion, you say, okay, I'm not going to budge for an hour. Then, of course, the armies of Mara show up. Like, oh, I'm hungry, or oh, I should have opened that window, or what time is it? Oh, no, 5 minutes. It must be more than 5 minutes. can't be only 5 minutes. That's mean 55 minutes to go. Oh, stop counting, stop counting. We've all been there. Again, I'm not reading anybody's mind. If you think I've got a camera in your shrine room, it's not true. It's statistics, not psychic powers. So then the armies of Mara show up, and these are depicted in various different ways. So first of all, Mara sends in the forces of temptation and tries to allure the Buddha with desire. And the Buddha is not fooled or not drawn in by any of the tempting sensual forms that Mara kind of sends in. So, okay, desire doesn't work. Let's try fear. So then Mara sends in the army with demons hurling rocks and spears and firing arrows at the Buddha. But according to the mythology, then the spears turned into shafts of light, and the rocks all turned into flowers and rained down around the Buddha, and nothing could come into the space under the Bodhi tree and harm the Buddha. He's just sitting there. And then the third force was the force of responsibility. The image of his father's tear-stained face appears. King Suddhodana saying, well, son, I know that this spiritual thing is really important to you, but, and I really wish you well, but, the kingdom is going to pieces in your absence, and your half-brother Nanda, he's a nice lad, he's a good-looking lad, but he's not a leader, I know I don't want to put any pressure on you, but, really, if you were in charge, the country would be fine, but without you, it's falling to pieces. No pressure, no pressure, you do what you need to do, but, it would be great if you could come back and take over. So then that was the last of the weapons of Mara, the force of responsibility, so desire and fear and responsibility, and the Buddha responds in the same way. He doesn't oppose Mara, he doesn't attack Mara, but he just says, I know you, Mara. So in this respect, Mara is the force of death. Mara means death, or the embodiment of evil, if you like. But rather than trying to destroy evil and wipe it out, then the gesture of the Buddha is to know it. That's the way that good and bad are transcended, both the harmful and the beneficial, is I know this. I know what you are. I know what this is. So at that moment, then Mara is defeated, but he won't retreat. And even though none of his attacks have worked, he then tries to intimidate the Buddha, the newly awakened Buddha. And he says, who do you think you are? You walked out on your wife and child, you're a failed husband, you walked out on your 5 ascetic companions, you started eating ordinary food, you're a failed husband, you're a failed yogi, and now you're trying to pretend to everyone that you're fully enlightened just because you can sit without moving. You're just half asleep, you're a lazy fool. Who are you trying to kid? You have nothing, you have no right to claim any kind of leadership. I'm the one who can claim the leadership of the universe. I'm one who is foremost in the universe. Isn't that right? And then his armies say, yes, indeed, Your Majesty, you are truly the foremost in the universe. And then Mara says to the Buddha, well, see, these are my witnesses. Who have you got to be your witness to what you say you are? So that's when the Buddha reaches down and touches the earth. And this is the most common Buddha image that you have around the Buddhist world. We have one down that end of the hall. You've got one this end of the hall. The Buddha reaching down with his right hand to touch the earth, because he calls the earth goddess, Dharani, to be his witness. And so the earth goddess, Dharani, rises up and she says to Mara, this is my true son, and he has done everything necessary to claim full and complete enlightenment, and you, Mara, are defeated. Then she unwraps her hair, and this huge flood appears from her hair, and all of Mara's armies are washed away, and then they come back with flowers and gifts and apologies. And so in terms of the theme for this afternoon, I feel this is significant because while the Buddha's experience of enlightenment, and again, this is just an interpretation of the myth, but I feel it's meaningful in this way, that the internal experience of enlightenment was there. His heart was completely liberated. The mind had awakened to its own nature. The Dhamma was awakened too, fully and completely. The unconditioned was realized, embodied. But as long as that was just an internal experience, the liberation wasn't complete. And it's only when the Buddha reached down and touched the earth and called the earth to witness, which is a way of recognizing, yes, there is the unconditioned, but there's also the conditioned. There's this body which needs to breathe, which needs to eat, which needs to move around, which has a family, which lives on a planet, which experiences gravity and lives with other beings. Yes, there is this. And in that gesture of acknowledging and accepting the conditioned, then total and complete enlightenment was fulfilled. So in a way, it wasn't fulfilled until that the conditioned had been recognized. And then from that time forth, then the Buddha traveled and taught for 45 years, living as a wandering yogi, as a wandering monk in northeast India, sharing his understanding. But so that engagement with the world and offering the teaching was not an imposition on that freedom, that rather the conditioned and the unconditioned were both fully realized and awakened to, and that rather than the conditioned being a kind of an obstruction or something that needed to be dealt with in a grudging way, it's rather the natural expression of the heart's full awakening is both a total liberation from the limits of the conditioned, but also a complete attunement to the conditioned at the same time. Go ahead. Yes.
I have a question. If you know that your tendency is taken too seriously, theoretically understand this about sunyata and emptiness and so on, but to introduce it to the heart, because if you take everything too responsible, too serious, that maybe you can include it to your daily meditation or some kind of practice that you can put emphasis to really introduce it to the heart. So not to know it just, I agree with everything you've said, but I see how heart reacts on different situations, and it seems it doesn't really see that it's not so real, not so serious. So maybe to make it kind of daily practice, if you know that it's your view that you make everything kind of too serious, too problematic. So maybe to introduce it to the heart, this, what you've said above, maybe a bit of advice. Thank you.
Okay. So in terms of taking these principles and introducing them into daily life experience, so that's what you're asking, Evgenia? Yeah. So there's a number of different approaches, and as I was saying about Ajahn Chah's teaching about the way to relate to sound, that is the sound annoying me, or am I annoying the sound? In a way, you can expand that to many aspects of our daily activity. When we talk about emptiness in the Southern Buddhist world, it doesn't just mean, say, a thing being empty of substance, like say this cup and the liquid. You can say, well, it's empty of substance, as is most of the atoms that comprise the glass and the liquid. They are mostly empty space. That there's the structure of an atom of molecules is mostly just space and vibrating energy. That's what matter is. So you're not just saying that when things are empty, they're empty of substance. But more often than not, when the Buddha uses the word sunya, empty, or sunyata, emptiness, it means empty of self and what belongs to a self. So when you are engaging in everyday activity and you're feeling those emotions of I like this, or I don't like that, or what does that person think of me, or oh dear, I'm late, or whatever the emotion might be, then particularly with emotions, the attention gets drawn. But I'm feeling worried, or I'm feeling excited, or I'm feeling annoyed, I'm feeling upset. The attention goes in to the content of the experience. So there's a lot of insight of the effort of insight meditation, vipassana, is to let go of the content of experience, to look at the nature of experiencing itself. So if you notice yourself feeling like, I'm worried, right? Then on a day-to-day, moment-by-moment practice, then to be mindful of that, the way that is being held, and to catch that, like taking a snapshot of it. No, it's not I'm worried. Is the mind is aware of the feeling of worry. So you kind of change the perception of it. Or I'm excited. The mind is aware of the feeling of excitement. This is excitement. It feels like this. Here is the mind. I wish I could understand what Ajahn Amaro is saying, but he talks too quickly. And he uses long words that I don't understand. So this is I wish I could understand Ajahn Amaro, but he talks too quickly and uses long words feeling. That's what this is. So that it takes, if you set the intention to do that, so that if you say, okay, during today, whenever the mind gets drawn into a mood or an emotion, liking, disliking, comfortable, uncomfortable, to notice that feeling of being drawn into the content and to deliberately step back and say, oh, this is the feeling of the mind being aware of worry. Here's the awake mind knowing worry. Here's the awake mind knowing excitement. The awake mind knowing inspiration or sadness, whatever it might be. And then in that moment, it doesn't take a big effort, but it's a particular effort. You know, like to take a key and put it in a lock and turn it. It's not like, you don't have to have a lot of muscle, but it has to be the right key, and you have to put it in the lock. So it's that kind of a particular effort. So if we do that, if we just catch that flow of the mind into the mood, and recognize that, oh, the mind is being born into liking, disliking, happy, unhappy, and then recognizes, oh, this is the awake mind knowing happy feeling, knowing unhappy feeling. Then if that key is put into the lock, then there's a change of heart. There's it's just unhappy feeling. It's just happy feeling. It's me being comfortable or me being uncomfortable. That's what it is. And so that the more that you do that, and the more that the mind is able to recognize that, that kind of freedom from grasping, just even if it's for half a second, the more you do that, then the more that becomes like a pathway that the mind follows. You're developing that as a path, so that that simple naming of the experience. And as Ajahn Sumedho put it very, very neatly many times over the years, he said, rather than seeing things in terms of me and my problems, see it as the Buddha mind knowing the way things are, the awake mind knowing the way things are. So not me and my problems, but the Buddha seeing the Dhamma. So you might think that sounds a bit inflated, but you can say the awake mind, the aware mind, knowing how things are. Another way of approaching it is to use a kind of questioning. Like say, there's this excited feeling. Yeah, who does this belong to? Does this feeling have an owner? Is this me and mine? Is it? And then using that kind of questioning in a conscious way, then you get that same kind of, there's an excited feeling or a worried feeling or a happy feeling. But when the mind says, who does this belong to? Does this have an owner? It's like turning the camera back onto the photographer. That like suddenly the photographer's in the picture. So that there's a sense of, what is that? Because that which knows a person is not a person. That awareness, that awake quality, isn't personal. Does that make sense? So it's aware, it knows, and it knows the personal qualities, being a woman, being a man, being old, being young, being Russian, being English, whatever you might be. But it doesn't. It's not Russian. It's not female or male or old or young or tall or short. It's just awake, aware. So that which knows the person is not a person. You're nodding, but does that make sense? It's because I'm only speaking to be helpful. But if we take that as a principle, then and we see what happens when that's used. Like, when we ask a question like, who does this belong to? What is it? If there's an owner of this feeling, what does that owner look like? In a way, they're impossible questions. But the point of asking that kind of question is not to come up with a sort of perfect philosophical idea, the real me is, but rather it's to create that, that kind of hesitation where the usual kind of self-creating habit is stopped. It hesitates, there's a pause where, that which is knowing this moment in the silent Amaravati it's just awareness. It's not a person. It doesn't belong to a person. It's not self. It doesn't belong to a self. Oh, so that is what you're aiming at. And the more that is cultivated, then the more that sort of creates a way that our experience is held. And in a mysterious, it's mysterious how it works, because that might seem like you're creating a kind of zoned out or dissociated. You know that word, dissociated? So like disconnected, like feeling of I'm just turning myself into a video camera, you know. But it's not. That in a mysterious way, when the mind lets go of grasping and personalizing, like I think, I feel, I want, I don't want, it lets go of that personalizing, then and lets the mind be free of that grasping and that identification, you find yourself more attuned to the people that you're with, the work that you're doing. Just like when the Buddha touched the earth, that's when the enlightenment was complete. That total letting go, then that results in a clearer connectedness and attunement to the world, rather than a spacing out or disconnect. That makes sense? So you can, as an ongoing daily practice, to both, it's like both of those actively developing what we call the reflective mind, or the mind that investigates, explores. So the Pali word for that is yoniso manasikara, another long word, but investigation or wise reflection. So it's consciously developing that quality that explores and so how does this work? You know, what's the pattern here? How does this operate? How does this function? So it's using our, so if you like, the active intelligence, and that in the mind which can recognize patterns, and also which is unbiased. It's not tied up with wanting this or not wanting that, or being afraid of this, or possessing that, and so on.
But just a question that maybe to do it, it's important to do it in the beginning, because if you're caught up in something, your mind already agitated, and if you even somewhere in the middle, you have a break and see it, like a bit step back, but then very quickly you're going back. Like you should make clear intention not to get lost again, or you should try to catch, like, you have some kind of activity and bring it to the mind, because, like, your tendency, and to bring this kind of reflection to the mind in the beginning, because, like, if you're already running, even if you stop for a second, a minute later you're running further.
Well, you have to see what really works, because you're the one who can judge. So that if you realize, okay, that flow of being carried away by something, it pauses for a second, but then even then, when the mind is getting carried away, it's like, oh, here's the feeling of being carried away again, and to see what effect that has. So I found that setting a clear intention at the beginning of a day, okay, during today, whenever the mind gets drawn into an emotion or an attitude, to be aware of that, and then you sort of set that as the program, the project for the day. And then even when you get completely lost and carried away, when you suddenly realize, oh my goodness, it's 3 PM, and I've been completely lost the whole day, then you can recognize, oh, this is the feeling of just waking up after 6 hours of being completely lost. It feels like this. So any other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Ajahn Amaro. Is conditioning, does it have a space? Are there boundaries? And doesn't conditioning, whether it is unconditioning or conditioning, also, is it connected with, for instance, karma, in terms of the conditions that come down? And also, is conditioning related, because conditioning probably is also relational? Does it relate to the wider outer elements in terms of our own being?
The list of different ways that things affect each other is very long. It's in terms of I haven't studied Abhidhamma very much, but I know there's what they call 24 list of conditioning factors, the way that things affect each other. And so that, and I haven't memorized, I mean, I've memorized it in Pali, but that wouldn't help very much. But even when you translate it into English, some of them are pretty obscure. But things affect each other in many and various different ways. Karma is one, the environment is another, your language is another, the state of sort of engagement with other beings, the situation is another. There's a whole book called Conditional Relations of the Abhidhamma that describes all of it in excruciating detail. But things affect each other in vastly complex and multifaceted ways, and so that. But I feel that that's the analysing them into sort of individual types and varieties is more of a kind of Abhidhamma type approach. And in terms of practice and what we can use effectively on a day-to-day basis is to simply be aware that this particular set of perceptions has come from a certain cause. You don't have to name exactly how. Like, you've asked a question. The question was in English. I'm speaking in English. English is the first language of a certain number of people here, but not of everybody by any means. So the language that we speak, how much of this question I've answered already. Am I making sense? Am I not making sense? How far into the afternoon we are. How much, whether you had a cup of tea or not to keep the mind alert or not. There are many various different conditioning factors. You don't have to name them all, but just to be able to say the pattern of this moment has come together through a huge variety of causes, and in this moment it feels this way. The pattern that we experience is conditioned. You don't have to name and detail exactly where every condition has come from, but in this moment it's like this. Just like if you're listening to an orchestra, there are maybe 60 or 70 instruments in the orchestra. You don't have to have memorized what each instrument is playing or know how each instrument works, how the strings vibrate or the air oscillates inside the flutes or the drums or the trombones. But you know the piece of music sounds like this. And it sounds like this because the orchestra is playing together. So there's many contributory causes, but you know that has come together in this form, in this moment. So that then that which is aware of, here is the experience of knowing the music, or Sunday afternoon talk at Amaravati. It's like this. How many? There's all of the people gathered here. There were decisions made to come to Amaravati on this Sunday afternoon to listen to this talk on the good, the bad, and the unconditioned. So incalculable numbers of contributory causes have made this moment exactly this way. So when the mind knows it's this way, this is the way it is, then that which knows the pattern of experience is not identified with it. It's not caught up in it. And the greater the degree of wisdom and satipanya, mindfulness and wisdom, the greater the degree of insight, then the more that the mind will know the qualities of this moment without greed, without hatred, without delusion, without bias. And so then that experience of the conditioned, let's say just the quality of this moment, can help the mind to let go and to be awake and to, at the same time, to realize the unconditioned, that quality of the transcendent Dhamma, that it doesn't disappear, but because of our attention to what we see, hear and smell, taste, touch and think, that we miss that. Like we don't notice the space in the room because the attention goes to the objects. We don't notice the space between the words because the attention is going to the words. Like if I hold up my hand, you say, hey, what do you see? You say, well, I see a hand with 5 fingers. You don't say, I see the spaces between your fingers. Most people wouldn't say that. A few people who hang around, these kind of people who say this kind of stuff would say, oh, there's spaces between your fingers, Ajahn. Got it in one. So we don't notice space. We don't notice the silence behind and between the sounds. We don't notice stillness because the attention gets caught by movement. So over and over again, say if you listen to Ajahn Sumedho's teachings many times, he would emphasize that one of his books was called "This is the Way It Is," and just to say, don't get caught up in the content. Just recognize the suchness that in this moment it's this way, and in that recognition of if it's this, that which knows that quality of the present is as it knows it, it's attuned to it, but it's also there's a liberation from it. There's a transcendence of it simultaneously. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. At the same time, having a transcendent mind, is it possible then to change conditions?
Well, of course. That's why the Buddha taught. I mean, he was because the mind is awake to the unconditioned. It doesn't mean to say that it's disconnected from the conditioned. It's a participatory reality, if you like. So when I don't like to use words like non-attachment all the time, or say being the watcher or being the observer. So I like the phrase unentangled participation. It's a bit long. You can shrink it down to hands-on letting go. So that just because the mind is detached, it doesn't mean to say that it's passive. Sometimes what we detach from is our hesitancy to act. What you let go of is your fear that something might be difficult or problematic. That's what's let go of. So that letting go, non-attachment, can lead to more activity and more engagement. So that if it was impossible to realize the unconditioned and engage with and act creatively with respect to the conditioned, how could the Buddha have ever taught? How could he have established the Sangha, bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, and the fourfold assembly of lay people and monastics? Couldn't have done it. He would have stayed under the Bodhi tree or been in a cave, kind of trying to just embody the unconditioned as an internal experience. But just as what I was saying in the talk is that because of that symbol of touching the earth, it means that quality of awakenedness is participating in the conditioned world without limitation by it. So that the Buddha was an incredibly creative thinker, amazingly imaginative. Just the list of similes, just completely unique ways that he used to describe things. He could just conjure up unique say descriptions of things just spontaneously talking to people. He'd be talking to a farmer and say, there are 11 ways that 11 things you need to take care of in terms of looking after cows. And he would go through, like cow husbandry, what you need to do to look after a cow properly, and then he would match those exactly onto what you do with the mind, just because he's talking to a cattle farmer, and you can tell that he just was doing it like right then and there. It just occurred to him with a whole neat list of this is how you look after cows, this is how you look after the mind, same, and using that symbology because that's what a cattle farmer would have understood. Or he's talking to a carpenter, or talking to a queen, or to someone who's a grandparent or a parent or whatever. He would use the circumstances of their life. Or a Brahmin who is believed in ritual bathing for purification. He uses similes of water. Or fire worshippers, he uses similes of fire. So he was an amazingly creative and imaginative thinker. And so out of that attunement to the awakening of the mind to the Dhamma, to that fundamental reality, then that engagement with the conditioned world and the mind's imaginative capacity and its verbal capacity to explain and to put things together was unobstructed. So that's why he was the unexcelled teacher of gods and humans, was that he could notice a situation, his mind would spontaneously come up with a teaching and forms and images that would be meaningful to that person at that time, and without that being any kind of limitation on his freedom, without that being anything that was a sort of a chore or a burden. So that I think it's a big mistake to think that if the mind is awake to the unconditioned, or is realizing nibbana. Therefore, it's kind of disconnected from the senses, and it can't do anything. In a lot of the commentarial literature, you have this sense that, and it's kind of weird that it's almost like an arahant is a zombie. That they can't look after themselves. They need to be sort of steered around and helped to get up and sit down. And it's almost they can't. An arahant can't make their own decisions, which is ridiculous, because just the life of the Buddha alone completely belies that. He was amazingly active and thoughtful, attentive to human nature. He was a very, very observant. So, and he was doing all of that from the basis of his mind being totally awake to the transcendent reality. So that the one does not occlude, does not shut out the other, but rather they are two facets of the same reality, I would say. Any other questions? Yes, Joanna in the front here.
Thank you. You said something about mind objects forming delusion, and I just wondered if you could say for me about mind objects being delusion or creating delusion. So if it's an unpleasant mind object.
In the passage I read from Ajahn Amaro.
Yeah, I just wondered if you could say more about that, because I've just been struggling a bit recently about trying to understand what delusion is in Buddhism as opposed to, delusion in normal life. Whether there is a difference.
Very good. So, wanting to be illumined about the nature of delusion. Yeah. Okay. So the passage was, if you feel happy over experiencing a pleasant mind object, that is delusion. If you feel unhappy over experiencing an unpleasant mind object, that is delusion. Unpleasant mind objects make you suffer, and pleasant ones make you happy. This is the world. Mind objects come with the world. They are the world. They give rise to happiness and suffering, good and evil, and everything that is subject to impermanence and uncertainty. When you separate from the original mind, everything becomes uncertain. So that it's like when the mind, say, that there's an unpleasant mind object, right? Like say a painful feeling in your leg. It's a painful feeling. When the attention gets drawn into that and makes it real, it kind of reifies it. That's my pain. Ow. That's a real solid thing that's there, that's being experienced by a real solid me here. Then the degree to which that is made solid by our attitude, by delusion, then there's suffering coming from that. The degree to which the mind is not, sort of, as he says, separated from its origin, from its source, and it knows, there is a painful feeling. There is the feeling of an I who's the experiencer. The feeling of an I, the feeling of the pain, they are both empty of self and what belongs to a self. They're all, there is no substance there. They're just patterns of experiencing, arising and passing away. That's all. Then the pain is still there, but it's still painful, but it doesn't have an owner, and the mind doesn't create suffering around it. So if you have a happy feeling, like you hear these words and you go, yeah, right, fantastic, I understand. This is great, maybe. So then that's a happy feeling. So if the mind then grasps that and says, wow, this is great, now I understand. Yes, that's I understand. I've got this understanding. I am happy. The degree to which there's an I and there's a happy feeling that's real, that's a cause of suffering. Which might seem very negative, but that's if you read much or listen to Ajahn Chah's teachings over and over and over again, he talks about the problems of grasping happiness. That none of us want unhappiness. Most of us want happiness, but then when we grasp at the good, we grasp at goodness, we grasp at happiness, and we try to own it and keep it and hold it, that inevitably becomes a cause for suffering. Like Ajahn Chah said in several of those readings, if you take hold of the good, it turns bad. So that their quality, delusion is the way that the mind forgets its nature, in a way. And I think there's a real person there. Joanna is a totally self-existent, independent entity, and she's there. And this is Ajahn Amaro here, who's a separate, totally independent entity, and he is talking to her as sort of fixed, separate realities. If the mind takes that to be absolutely true, then there's going to be dukkha. If instead there's a recognition of, well, there's a perception of two beings talking with each other, these perceptions arise and pass away, they have no intrinsic substance, and they don't have an owner, they're not a self, they don't belong to a self. This is just the play of mental activity. It's like this. Then the mind is holding it in a completely different way. It's seeing in terms of I've got this, or I am this, or you are that, but rather there is this. There's the patterns of experiencing arising and passing away. In one of the speaking in terms of pleasant experiences and kind of enlightened experiences, there's a really interesting sutta called the 5 and the 3, which is Sutta 102 in the Middle Length Discourses. And at the end of it, the Buddha is saying, there can be someone who's sitting meditating, and they have this, the mind is clear and awake and peaceful and bright, and within them there arises the feeling, I am at peace, I am without clinging, I have realized Nibbana. And he says, the very way the mind phrases that indicates the clinging that is still there. Damn. See, because, I can never be free because I am the prison. The person is the prison. The person can't be free. So it's really kind of not accurate to say, an arahant is an enlightened person. More like the enlightened mind knows personhood arising and passing away. But to say that, to say, I mean, I don't want to get too lost in detail, but rather than saying an arahant is an enlightened person, so there is the enlightened mind that knows the experience of personhood arising and passing away, that the mind is not identified with the body or the personality or the personal story, and that but rather than that non-identification, that non-attachment, then turning into a kind of dismissiveness of the mind is perfectly unattached, therefore someone else can feed this body, or I'm not going to bother going to the doctor. If this body lives or dies, I don't care. So rather than there being a sort of dismissive or a sort of rejection, if the mind is fully awake, then there's no reason why it wouldn't initiate going to the doctor if there were some weird symptoms that needed attending to. It wouldn't worry about it or make a problem out of it or turn it into a self, but it'd say, oh look, that liquid should be on the inside, not the outside, It's getting all over the floor. I should do something about it. Maybe I should do something about that and get it fixed, because it's kind of messy and people will get upset when they see all this red stuff pouring out. So, I'm kind of exaggerating, but I think you get the point. So that delusion is the way in which the mind makes the impermanent permanent, or tries to make the impermanent permanent. It tries to make the unsatisfactory satisfactory. And it tries to make what is not self into self. So that's the kind of classic description of delusion is that we're looking for certainty in that which is uncertain. We're looking for satisfaction in that which can't satisfy. It doesn't mean to say we don't have pleasant experience. Like Magandhya, I say, well, why do you say no to all this stuff? Like if you eat a mango, a sweet mango, isn't it delicious? And it doesn't use exactly that example in that sutta, but the Buddha would say, yes, it's delicious, but how many mangoes can you eat? That if you're hungry and you're given a mango and you're not diabetic, or the sweetness of a mango is something that's pleasant to you, then if you're hungry and you're given some mango, you go, oh, delicious. But then if you think eating mango is happiness, then 2 mangoes, 3 mangoes, 4 mangoes, 5 mangoes will make you happy. So Ajahn Chah, being the kind of dharmic extremist that he was, he had this policy of every so often he would give his mind what it wants. And he could see a lot of his Dhamma talks revolve around food obsessions, various kinds. And he was it was the mango season, and he could see himself on the alms round getting excited as he was going through the village, very proper, kind of looking at the ground, and walking along, and kind of his eyes going up to the trees and checking to see how ripe the mangoes were. And, oh, wow, there's a lot this time. Interesting. And kind of eager to get back to the monastery and so he saw his mind doing this. He said, okay, mangoes, you want mangoes? I'll give you mangoes. So he ate 37 of them. He said he just kept going until he physically couldn't eat anymore. Okay, you want mangoes? You'll get mangoes. And there's a particular day, a festival where they make these little sweets in the northeast of Thailand. It's a kind of not quite gelatin. It's sort of that kind of sticky paste that you get from the rice wrapped in the banana leaf. It's like it's sort of chewy and gluey with some sweet stuff in the middle. Kind of small, sort of triangular sweet. What are they called? Konomsai. So there's one particular time when the villagers would make a lot of these for a certain festival, Konomsai, and so he could see himself. Oh, that day's coming. The festival day's coming. So he could see his mind creating around these particular sweets, these konom. And so again, he did the same thing, and I think he ate 84 of them. So do you want them? You really want them? Okay, I'll give you them. So his whole bowl, he had a big alms bowl, his whole bowl was just filled with these things. So he was a very kind of hands-on teacher. He would use these sort of object lessons. Okay, these will make you happy. More will make you happier, right? Okay, let's test it out. So by the time he got to sort of number 84, it was like... And then also, because he would do that, and he would encourage that, once in a while, give your mind what it's asking for, as long as it's not breaking any of the precepts. Because if you keep saying, no, I shouldn't, then you make it powerful. You give it strength. And so the delusion is the happiness is in the kanomsai, or the mango, or the whatever. But it's not the happiness is in the mind. And so it's breaking that delusion that the happiness is in the sweet, and that therefore more sweets equals more happiness. So it's okay, let's just take it to the limit. So you end up eating 37 mangoes or 84 kanomsai. And then but then he would do it deliberately. And when part of him is going, oh no, not more. Keep going, don't stop, keep going. Until he's literally incapable, he just can't. He couldn't take any more. And then he would mindfully watch, okay, now you got what you wanted, more than what you wanted now, how is it? So during the day, then he would watch his mind, his kind of guts kind of churning away and so on, and say, okay, you got what you wanted, how does it feel? You got what you wanted, how does it feel? So that, where's the happiness? So that it was quite reflective. He was using that sort of examining, okay, you followed that you believed that the promise that was where happiness was in that taste. Now, where is it? What's the result? So that, and that kind of careful observing, okay, what's the result of that? And they're not saying I'm a bad monk, I've got so many food obsessions, I'm awful, I'm not creating a self around it, but just here's the cause, here's the effect. Like with Don's question about causality. Okay, that this is the cause, this is the effect. Now, how does it feel? What's the result of that? And then you just let the result speak for itself. So he became extremely wise around desire and obsessions. So that follow this advice with care. We should have a sort of Amaravati health warning. So maybe if our health and safety people are saying, "What are you saying, Ajahn? You're being recorded," and people are going to take this the wrong way. And so don't try this at home. Well, only with adult supervision to help you. But I wouldn't belittle the fact that was very skillful. It was a skillful way of breaking that delusion, because that's what the mind is saying. That makes me happy. Hearing that makes me happy. That's a beautiful sound, or that's a beautiful taste, or that's a beautiful object. But it's not. It's like when we hear, say, music, oh, it's so beautiful. It's perfect. I love that music. You don't love the music. You love what happens in your heart when the music is heard. What you love is your own mind. It's the music triggers that effect. So you don't love the music, you love the place the music takes you to. And so the more that we recognize that it's mind, that mind is the thing that really matters, then you recognize, well, the happiness is not dependent on the object. The happiness is dependent on the mind and the attitude. So that the more that we work in that way and work on the mind, the heart, to develop skillful attitudes, then the more our happiness becomes independent of circumstances, whether we're comfortable or uncomfortable, whether people approve of us or disapprove of us, whether the weather's sunny or rainy. I mean, now, a cold, rainy weekend, how many people are thinking, oh, great, at last, right? Now, if it was a cold, rainy weekend at the end of July, after 8 cold, rainy weekends through June and the early part of July, we'd be thinking, oh, no, not again. But because we've been roasted for weeks and weeks and weeks, then cold, rainy weather, we go, oh, wow, this is so great. At last. It's a conditioned perception. So the more that we recognize that the mind, as I said, the first line of the Dhammapada, the mind is the forerunner of all things. Mind precedes all things. The more that is really taken to heart, then our happiness becomes independent of circumstances. Whether we are comfortable or uncomfortable, healthy or sick, approved or disapproved. It doesn't mean that we're numb or that we're insensitive or that we don't care, but our happiness is independent of those ups and downs of life. I think that's probably a good point to finish on. 4 o'clock has been reached, so I offer these thoughts for everyone's consideration.